Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's class, which is all about the Tender Bar. I'm Brooke Warner, and I'm here with Linda Joy Myers. Hi, Linda Joy.
Hi, Brooke, and hi, everybody. Welcome to our class.
Yeah, welcome to today. We have an hour to talk about the Tender Bar, this amazing memoir, and it's nice to see a lot of familiar names. We would love you to say hi and let us know where you're calling in from if you want to put your names and hello in the question window, and also just get you familiarized with the question window, because if you want to put notes to us as we're teaching, we welcome that, and we'll eyeball them as we go, and some of them we might parking lot until the end. But some of them, if they're super pertinent to what we're talking about, then that's great. And it's fun to see, that people are calling in from all over the country and sometimes from all over the world. We have at least some Canadians and people from both coasts and Albuquerque, so it's fun. Thanks, everybody. Hi, hi,
hi. Hi, everyone. So glad you're with us today.
All right, and here's who we are for those of you who are not familiar with us. Linda Joy, take it away.
Hi, yes, I'm Linda Joy Myers. I'm the president and founder of the National Association of Memoir Writers, and I've written 2 memoirs, Don't Call Me Mother and Song of the Plains, and 2 books on the craft of memoir writing, The Power of Memoir and Journey of Memoir.
And I'm Brooke. I'm the publisher of She Writes Press, and I have a coaching practice, Warner Coaching. All this stuff here's my bio reads on. I have a new book coming out in August, and so I'm excited about that, called Write On Sisters. And then Linda Joy and I together have written Breaking Ground on Your Memoir. We're the co-editors of The Magic of Memoir, and then we have a new craft series that we're going to be launching this fall, so we'll share that with you. But these are going to be these craft-based classes that we're teaching, like on structure and scene. We're going to be turning those into some ebooks. So we are just very much memoir enthusiasts coming to this, offering lots and lots of free classes and some paid classes, short classes, long classes, and some of you are alumni of some or more of those. So it's also wonderful to have people back. And without further ado, let's get into the Tender Bar.
Yes, it's one of our, just to say ahead of time, it's just, we loved this book, and then we decided to teach it, and then we loved it more. So we're really happy to be going through what makes it work here with you on the free class, and then the 4-week class coming up.
Yeah, totally. So agreed. All these years we've been referencing it, and now we finally said, let's teach that book and see what's so special about it. So let's start with theme. So there is so much to unpack in this book. One of the things that happened to me as I was preparing for today's class was I just realized how much J.R. Moehringer is doing in this book that is incredible. and theme is one of the most incredible things that he does, in all honesty, because as I say here, he tightly weaves these themes. Linda Joy and I teach in our long class about this notion that the theme is the North Star. And what do we mean by that? It orients you to the work that you are writing on the page. So if you're in scene or you're telling a story, then you would ask yourself, does this have anything to do with my themes? And if the answer is no, then that can help you to know whether or not you're on the right path. And that's what we mean by North Star. Theme is such an important aspect of memoir, and I think that it's under celebrated in some ways because it's not really seen. It's something that is almost inherent, or I've talked about it in class too, as the air that the reader breathes. And so it has this way of infiltrating itself into your writing, and it is really clearly important because of the way that memoir is slice of life. It's about part of your life and not the whole life, and that's where memoir is different from autobiography. It attempts to enter into a slice of your life, and or perhaps even more importantly, you see these pieces of your life through a particular frame or through a particular lens. And that is what theme is. It's all these ways of thinking about your story that is that's very high level, and again kind of in the air that you breathe. And so he has themes, many themes, but fatherlessness, manhood, drinking culture, and baseball were a few that I plucked out because obviously these fatherlessness and manhood are perhaps two of the biggest themes that he's exploring in this book. And he does it in this really uh, almost, I don't want to say underground, because certainly you know it's there and you understand that that's what the book is about. But as is the case with theme, he's not pounding you over the head with it. He's not trying to. I sometimes think what happens is that people have a theme or an agenda, and then it can come across like, okay, yeah, we get it already. And the way that you tightly weave your themes is that you start to have ahas and insights and bits of reflection about these various things that you want to talk about, and then you write to them, right? Like they come in all of these different very skilled ways in the writing. And so the best way for me to show some of these to you are through examples. So let's look at what he does, particularly around these themes of fatherlessness and manhood. For those of you who have the book and want to read along, the page numbers are here. But the first one on page 89, he says, I closed my eyes, let my head fall back against the seat, and felt the voices and the smoke swirling around me. Anyone happen to see Mahoney last Friday night? Question is, did Mahoney see anyone? The man was blind, tight as a tick. He must have had some hangover the next morning. He should take the cure. I hear his old lady's had it with his shit. Where'd you hear that? So this is all like this kind of dialogue that he gets from the guys at the bar when he's still pretty young. But I'm setting it up to give you guys a sense of like, okay, he closes his eyes and lets his head fall back against the seat and starts listening to the guys talk, right? And as he goes on and on with this particular way that the guys at the bar talk into the next page, you see this part that on page 90 that says, gradually the voices converged into one male voice until I felt as if I were listening to the voice. But this was better because when I opened my eyes, the source of this voice was right there. And so I want to just point out how he talks about it converged into one male voice. You know, there is this kind of maleness, and the voice, for those of you who have finished the book and know, that is his father. And so when he capitalizes the voice, he's talking about his own dad, who is absent. Let me get through these because there are a lot of examples, but I want to just show you the way that he speaks to things. It's like it's so part of the story that unless you're really, really paying attention, you might gloss over, you know, the amount of times that he references pieces and little bits here and there about being a man. You know, so here on page 152, this is his cousin Cheryl. At Grandpa's house, I threw some things into a bag and Cheryl kissed me goodbye. Be a man, she said, not in her typical way, but in a tender, encouraging way, as if she believed I would be. And so just these little snippets, but it's all over the place. And it's one of the things that I most enjoyed about the book, because in coming back to these themes over and over and over again, he's reiterating, and yet he's doing it in this really, as I've said already, you know, tightly woven way. On page 184, right in the middle, he's talking about reading. You know, he begins to develop this love for reading when he goes to Arizona. And he says, I read for hours without a break, discovering to my delight that aside from the longing for home, the poem was also about men and the tinfoil armor of manhood. I held my breath as I came upon the scene between Hector, the greatest Trojan warrior, and his infant son. Hector, dressed for battle, says goodbye to the boy. Don't go, Hector's wife pleads, but Hector must. It's not his will, but his fate. The battlefield calls. He holds the boy, beautiful as a star shining, kisses him goodbye, then says a prayer. Someday let them say of him, he is better by far than his father. And so all of these stories that he tells, he circles around this idea of fatherlessness and manhood over and over and over again in such a way that you feel how important it is to him. Interestingly, Linda Joy and I recently went to go see Danny Shapiro speak, and one of the things that she said when she was talking is that theme is another word for obsession. And
Mm-hmm.
I appreciated that so much because you could look at it that way. It is an obsession, but you also have to learn to give yourself enough distance from that obsession so that your reader doesn't feel that it's an obsession. You know, that your reader just feels like it's the thing that you're circling around that you're trying to unpack. And that is what he is doing in this book, is unpacking and unpacking and unpacking. In the interest of time, because I clearly included too many examples because in my excitement, I'm only going to read one more, but you guys can look these up after the fact, and when we send the recording, we'll send the slides along with them. So let's look at the last example that I'm going to read aloud, which is 375. And he's talking about Steve, who owns the bar, you know, which was Dickens and later becomes Publicans. And he says, I felt a surge of love for Steve and for Colt and for all the men in Publicans because I finally figured something out. I'd always assumed the men hadn't heard Steve call me Junior, but of course they had. They simply hadn't adopted the nickname because they sensed its significance to me. Steve didn't understand and they didn't explain. The men of Publicans never explained. They just let Steve continue calling me Junior, and they never did, not once. It was a break with protocol, an act of tenderness, which I'd failed to recognize until that night. And I read this example because what he's doing here is showing how these men were stand-ins for a father and how they taught him manhood. And that really is the arc of his thematic journey. And it's so really brilliantly executed. And so what I want to offer to all of you guys as you're thinking about your theme is every single story that you share, ask yourself, you know, am I pointing in the right direction? Am I paying attention to this stuff? Am I circling around it? You know, is it this thing that I want to explore and unpack and understand better? And if the answer is yes, then it will start to show up in your writing in a more powerful way, just like it does in the Tender Bar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are really great examples. And, you know, the thing that one of the big things that we noticed, other than the enormous capacity for him to weave the themes through an almost 400-page book, is how relatable and how easy it was to be with J.R. Moehringer as he is telling his story. And this is the narrative voice. People are always asking us, you know, what about narrative voice and narration? And I mean, and they can get kind of worried about it, but you know, it's the storyteller. The storyteller is unraveling this tale. And I think that what we notice when we're teaching sometimes is that the you know, the students, the writers are, you know, struggling with, well, if narration, is it part of a scene? Is it summary? What is it? And so wanted to address a little bit of that here. There's so much more to talk about, and of course there's many examples also. But the thing about narration is if you use specific details, it stays interesting and it becomes scenic because people are experiencing, just like in the little picture of the elephant, all the different aspects of experience: the sight, the sound, the touch, the feel, the texture, the smell, the whole thing. And I'll show you some examples of how he does that. But the other thing that we notice that helps people kind of integrate how to, you know, the storyteller part of themselves is that to keep an eye on the different types of the narrator. Now, we take the narrator for granted. You know, when you're reading a book, you're just moving along, you're in it, you're being guided through the story. You're being guided through time and what happens to people and inside the head of the protagonist in particular, and so on. And so we found it helpful to name these kinds of narration. And so we have guiding. The guiding narrator and then the reflective narrator. And like we're saying here, the goal is to keep the reader engaged in your story and to be moved emotionally in what they're reading. Again, it keeps us tightly woven. We also teach in another class the whole idea of John Gardner's the quote fictive dream, and I'll talk more about that. But it just means that the story is woven tightly enough that the reader does not fall out of it. And the way that we fall out of it is there's gaps in what the narrator is doing. There are flat places where you're just like clunk, there's nothing interesting going on. And so the guiding narrator leads us through time and place and helps us stay oriented. A lot of times, if we're reading students' work, we go, well, where are we right now? And we teach scene and how to keep track of the scene and all that, which is all very helpful. And in the narration, where is the protagonist in time and place? And then when they're reflecting or thinking or feeling or musing, where are they? I remember in my early work, a teacher said, well, you have all this musing going on, but where are you? It can't just be floating in space. And that was a very, very helpful thing to hear, that to remember that when we're writing our story and we're reacting and reflecting and remembering, we are doing that in the scene, in the chapter, somewhere in the world, on the earth. So in the reflective narrator creates an intimacy with the reader. And we're always saying in our feedback to students, what were you thinking when that happened? The what happened is important. Something significant happened, or we wouldn't be writing a scene, we wouldn't be telling that story. But what happened is woven together with how you reacted to it, what you thought about it, what you did after you heard about whatever it was that is happening. And so these are things to keep in mind. And in this book, we're going to teach it in depth in the 4-week class coming up. But in the book, I found I never fell through the dream of the story. He is so good at weaving all this together. So I want to give a couple of examples next for you to look at of first guiding. And notice I highlighted about time and how he's guiding us. And so he says, I went to the beach every day that summer, weather and hangovers permitting. Upon opening my eyes in the morning, I'd first check the sky, then consult with Grandma about what time Uncle Charlie had come home from Dickens. Fair skies and an early night meant the more time I spent with Charlie and the more I talked like him and walked like him. I put a hand to my temple when deep in thought I leaned on my elbow when I choose. He's giving specific examples of how he's like Charlie. One night I found him alone at the dinner table, and he goes on to present an entire scene there. But he lets us know, and you'll see it all the way through the book, when things were happening in relation to the other things that were happening. And therefore we're fully guided through the through the story, and we don't wonder where we are or when we are. So one more example now.
A lot of people are asking for the page numbers, Linda Joy, even though it's on the screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. This was page 96. Yeah. Page 96 is the first one, and then the next one is page 71. And there's the context here, and the context of this is his mother just told him to do his best, and this is in 6th grade, and you see his thinking. According to my black and white view of the world, it wasn't enough to do my best. I had to be perfect, to take care of my mother, to send her to college. I needed to eliminate all mistakes. I needed to correct those mistakes and avoid making new ones. And by getting perfect grades and getting into the perfect college, he could do that. But with school getting harder, I couldn't see how I was going to be perfect. And if I were imperfect, then my mother and grandmother would be disappointed with me, and I'd be no better than my father. And then my mother would sing and cry and peck at her calculator. This was how my mind raced. Now, in this passage, we're very close to him. We are in his mind and in his heart. And there are many examples, which I think is a very interesting part in the first 100 or more pages particularly, but it's all the way woven through the book, of the psychology of the protagonist through his intimate reflections about what he's worried about. And he is a worrier. It becomes one of the, again, a through thread that Brooke's going to talk about more in the other teaching that we do. It weaves all the way through the book. And so, these are just a few examples of how this narrator is skillfully guiding us so we stay with him.
Perfect. Yes. And I will hope to get to the through threads, but what I realize is, like, as I said, there was just so much in this class that, and we'll unpack it more in the long class, but so much in this that he's doing and doing well, that I think the through threads might have to be saved for the long class, because they are connected to theme. So I'm going to talk to you about characters, and one of the things that J.R. Moehringer does so brilliantly is this great character development. And for those of you who spent time with the book, you hopefully will have noticed the amount of time that he spends characterizing people. I put here in the slide that it is exquisite detail. And we find in our classes a lot that people don't tend to give themselves the permission to delve into that level of observation. Students often basically preempt and decide for themselves what is interesting or what is too much. And so if you liked the level of characterization that he gave, the very detailed way of talking about the guys at the bar and his grandfather, and his grandmother and his cousins, everybody was very alive on the page. You had a very clear visual of what these people were like. I grew up in California, and I felt like I stepped into New York. It couldn't have been more visiting a place, like being in Manhasset and just seeing what that is like and how the people talk. And so there's this way in which he invites you into the room. You're in the bar with him, you're in his grandfather's house with him. And that is a real skill. And one of the ways that that is done is through characters. Now, certainly place and scene and all of that stuff are other skill sets that you have to build these worlds or to build the fictive dream, like Linda Joy was talking about. But characters are a really big part of that. And so I always feel like when we're talking about the relevance, when we're trying to teach these books, like what can you take from them and do and integrate into your own writing, certainly these are the kinds of things that come up for me, is more and better characterization, which really means the way that you describe the people on the page, more detail. Character tagging is like, he talks about the guys like, he gives them names like fucking babe, for instance, or the guy that he refers to as looking like a Muppet, so much so that when his girlfriend meets them, she's like, oh, the one that looks like a Muppet. It's like you have a real sense of what these guys are like. And then finally, I put here things and places as characters because I'm going to show you the way in which he has some things like the bicentennial couch that is actually a character because of how much it shows up in the book. So let's look at some of the examples. The men are incredible, right? I just found myself like completely mesmerized by his descriptions. And so it doesn't matter if you like them or not. Okay, that's not really the point. The point is, does he do a good job of showing you what they're like? And I think that, the answer, of course, is yes. And so on page 86, right in the middle of the page, um, each of the men also went by a nickname Steve had bestowed, except Uncle Charlie, who had two, Chaz and Goose. After 10 minutes, I was juggling so many nicknames that I felt as if there were a dozen men in the car instead of the four I counted. The men then confused me further by rattling off a list of other nicknames, people who had stopped into Dickens the night before, like Sooty and Sledge and Rifleman and Skeezix and Tank and Fuckin' Babe. Who's Fuckin' Babe? I asked. I knew I wasn't supposed to talk, but the question flew out of my mouth. The men looked at each other. Fucking Babe's the porter, Uncle Charlie said. Sweeps up the joint, does odd jobs. How come you call him Fucking Babe? That's all he ever says, Colt explained. So it's like part of the characterization is the dialogue, too, the way that these men talk, how they talk to each other, how he describes his own interactions with them. It's very seamless. And we recommend that you guys read your dialogue out loud because it really helps you to understand, is it reading how people talk? Oftentimes dialogue is just so staid, so pay attention to that as well. On page 96, this is just a little snippet. It says, the more time I spent with Uncle Charlie, the more I talked like him, walked like him, aped his mannerisms. I put a hand to my temple when deep in thought. This is Linda Joy read this too in another part, which is interesting, but it's like there's this or there's a reiteration, but the more I talked, I love how he says, the more I talked like him, walked like him, aped his mannerisms. So there's this way that he's showing how the men are impacting him, but also gives you a sense of the character and who the guys are. And of course, we're not even delving into the grandparents and the mother. Everyone is so interesting. So let's see. On page 92, Publicans was wall-to-wall storytellers, but none had Bob the cop's ability to hold our attention. Part of it was fear. If we stopped listening, would he punch us? But part of it was his delivery, which worked along the same principle as Hemingway's spare style. Bob the cop wasted no time, no energy. And that just goes on. This goes on for a page of what Bob is like. And so it's incredible how he describes people. And on page 120, I'm not going to read any more than what is here, but listening to McGraw, admiring his height and wingspan and the incredible width of his trunk and legs. He, as I said before, this permission to describe and explore what people look like and what is going on the page is just really, really enjoyable. And then I just wanted to share the bicentennial sofa, just because it's something you guys can do. This is only one portion of the many times that he talks about the bicentennial sofa, and it becomes a character, and you guys might have opportunities to do things like that in your own book, particularly if you have interesting things that populate your story. So I'm only going to read this first one, which is when he first introduces it. And he's talking about his grandfather's house, the shit house, which, is awful in every way. But he says, the only new objects in the house were the drinking glasses, borrowed from Dickens, and the Sears living room sofa, upholstered in hypnotically hideous pattern of Liberty Bells, bald eagles, and faces of the founding fathers. We called it bicentennial sofa. And that's it, but then it just keeps coming up, and all of these scenes have the bicentennial sofa in it, to the point where when you read it and you envision this hideous and funny sofa, you kind of can't help but just be like, to feel like you're there. And that is a lot of the point of this, is this invitation onto the page to experience what he is experiencing in this kind of like very intimate way. And I hope that you guys all who enjoyed it and read it felt like you were invited into his world, because that I think is the skill set. Linda Joy and I were talking before as we were preparing for class, saying, J.R. Moehringer did not have a particularly extraordinary childhood or life. In some ways you might argue that there were lots of it that was like very sad and lonely, but what he's managed to do is make his life sparkle. It's like this, even despite, some of this stuff that is real hardships and real kind of drag him out experiences that he has, and these situations that he gets himself into. But because of this stuff that he's doing, as I said earlier, like the circling around the theme, the really great narration, these characters that just pop off the page. I was thinking about how he was writing about Uncle Charlie and what a character he was, and how smart these guys were in their certain kind of street smart ways, right? You get invited into a world. I mean, for some of you, this might have been very familiar, but for me, this was a very foreign world. And I really felt like I had a seat next to him at the bar. And so that is what you're attempting to do, is to give someone whose life could not be more different from yours a seat next to you, an opportunity to really, really feel it. And so these ways that we're talking about are all the different ways that you can.
Yes, a seat at the bar without getting blotto on alcohol. We're just there with him, right next to him. Yeah, he talks a lot about the effects of alcohol, which is another theme. But anyway, we'll get into that later in the other class. So, we do a lot of teaching, and there's these real building blocks to creating a good story. And what we're talking about tonight we wanted to share on this call, the basic building blocks that all of us need to know, that all of us need to use. And scene is one of the greatest of these, in the sense that a scene invites the reader into your life, but into your heart, your body, and your mind, and invites the reader to be with you very, very intimately. And one of the things that we were reminded when we reread, both of us had read Tender Bar, of course, before and loved it, but then reading it again, it's very, very intimate. And it doesn't matter whether you're a woman or a man. That's another thing I want to say about the power of scene and the power of narration. Is gender doesn't have anything to do with it. It's about, there are times when definitely the story is about him looking to become a man, but when I read it, I go, yeah, and how did I look to become a woman or a girl? Who were my models? Who did I try to learn from? And so there's this universal element by using such specifics. And so the most specific, the more specifics you can use, the deeper that you're going to be taking the reader on their own journey as you share yours. So more about scenes, just like narration is grounded, scenes take place at a particular time and place, and they are about something significant that is happening. The scene, everyone is playing things out in real time, like in dialogue. Some of the things that Brooke was reading, and there's many places where in the book where things are unfolding and something else unfolds and something else unfolds. And what we teach is that, to really look at what are the significant moments that you need to share. Sometimes they're big moments, like we call them turning point moments. There's interactions with certain people that change everything. Characters interact in a scene also. There's often dialogue. There's a lot of dialogue skill in the Tender Bar, which we're going to teach in the 4-week class, and sensual details. So sensual details are a huge and important part of a scene, and there's reasons why they're so important, why sensual details are so important. So I'm just going to mention this briefly. It's pretty exciting stuff. They've done a lot of brain imaging of writers and readers, and looking at what happens in the brain when someone's reading a story versus when someone is reading some factual, flat information. So when someone's reading a story, and they've tested both ends of this, both the reader and the writer, the brain of the reader lights up in the same way as it does in the writer when they're writing the scene. And it's the specifics of the scenes that make the brain light up in pretty colors. This is what we have here. Red and yellow and blue, and different parts of the brain light up when different things are, whether it's taste or smell or texture, the brain lights up in a different way, and it lights up. It doesn't just sit there unaffected. So what you're doing when you're in a scene and doing it well is you are painting an experience for the reader to be inside of. You're inside, just like Brooke said, she's at the bar with JR and all these other people. That is how well he painted his scenes, and it's all the way through the book, with his mother, with his grandparents, with all these other people. We are there very, very fully. Let's look at page 94 on the next slide and look a little bit at what he's doing there. And as you see at the bottom, I mentioned this whole brain thing, which I think is pretty exciting and amazing. So I'm going to read what's here just a little bit more so you get the full feeling of this moment. So on page 94, it's early in the story. He is falling in love with all of these men, and he is just hanging on every word and every detail and what they say. And in this moment, he's just like he's like falling in love with this place. Uncle Charlie poured himself a drink, fixed me a Roy Rogers, and told me to occupy myself. I hopped on a bar stool and spun in slow circles. Hanging upside down from wooden slats above the bar were hundreds of cocktail glasses which caught and reflected the light of the bar room like a vast chandelier. Along a 40-foot shelf behind the bar were scores of liquor bottles in a rainbow of colors, also reflecting the light. The overall effect was like being inside a kaleidoscope. I ran my hand along the bar top, solid oak, 3 inches thick. The surface was a tawny orange yellow, like the skin of a lion. I petted it tentatively, and I admired the tongue and groove floors, buffed smooth by a million footsteps. I studied my reflection in the old-fashioned silver cash registers, which looked as if they'd come from a general store on the prairie. With that same rapture and transport I normally experienced while pretending I was Tom Seaver, I now pretended I was the most popular person in Dickens. The place was jam-packed. It was late at night. I was telling a story and everyone was listening. Quiet, everyone. The kid is telling a story. Now, I love this partly because toward the end of it, he's a storyteller. Even as a child, he has his own stories to tell. But you can see here how sensual and how beautiful and how much he's falling in love with this place and how detailed it is here. And then one more example on page 65. And again, these are portraits. These are essentially, the bar is its own character also, but these are portraits of the bar again. And I chose it because it has a lot of smell this time, a lot of aromas. Page 65. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that the air was actually a beautiful pale yellow, though I couldn't see any lamps or any possible source of light. The air was the color of beer and smelled of beer. Each breath tasted like beer, malted, foamy, thick. Cutting through the beer smell was an odor of corruption and decay, though not unpleasant, more like that of an old forest in which rotting leaves and mold refresh your faith in life's endless cycle. There were also notes, faint notes of perfumes and colognes, hair tonics and shoe creams, lemons and steaks and cigars and newspapers, and an undertone of brine from the Manhasset Bay. My eyes watered as they did at the circus, where the air had a similar animal musk. Now, many people writing about being in the bar would say, it smelled like beer and, sweat or something, which it does. But notice how he spins it out. He comes out with also similarities and differences. Perfumes and colognes are similar. Hair tonics and shoe creams are different. Lemons and steaks and cigars and newspapers are all different. And so he's painting this broader picture through smell, through the scent of that place. And you can feel it, All right.
Got that? We might have lost Linda Joy. I'm not exact. That has not happened before, but the perfect timing because she was just talking about how beautifully rendered that particular example is. And now that we're nearing the end here, I will actually go back to the through threads because I was worried that I didn't have enough time, and a couple of you were asking about it. And take. Are you back, Linda Joy?
Yes, I'm back. Sorry.
Oh, okay, perfect. I'm going to go back to the through threads just because I have the 3 minutes and I thought I lost you. So 1 second here. So let me just say about the through threads is kind of circle back to themes, and then we're going to do the Q&A for those of you who are curious about it, because through threads are part of theme. And so the 2 through threads that I chose were his blanket and his mother's lies. And so this notion, and I'll just tell you about them and you guys can read about them yourself. And for those of you who read the book, you probably well remember that on page 24, he introduces his blanket, as a loyal friend in a cruel world, that his mother saw it as an adult emotional disorder in the making. And then much later, you can see on page 175, 174, 175, he talks about this metaphor of the blanket, right? This idea, which I think is just so powerful, that he says that sometime after my plane took off, I realized why I wasn't traumatized about saying goodbye. I'd been saying goodbye to my mother since I was 11, sending me to Manhasset, urging me to bond with Uncle Charlie. My mother had been weaning me from her and herself from me by imperceptible degrees. And it's just like the blanket, right? He says, my mother had been subtly, secretly snipped away. Sorry, my mother had subtly, secretly snipped away a sliver of herself every summer. And so those are threads because it's taking a concept from an earlier idea that you share and then delivering on it later in the book. And all the memoirs that we teach have these kinds of through threads. On the mother's lies, I'll let you guys again look at this, but the way that his mother lies is kind of fascinating because, to his point, she's the most honest person he's ever known, but she was a liar, and she lies to protect people and to make people feel better, and we all know people like that. And there's all these moments where she lies, throughout the book, but they're little lies, but it also makes his mother an imperfect character because otherwise she might be a little too perfect. They have a very close relationship, but she's a very nuanced character. And I think he achieves that by showing, this little thing about her that is flawed, although it's kind of charmingly flawed. So, all right. So thanks for indulging me to go back to that. And we'll talk a lot more about it in the 4-week class. So just one word, on the 4-week class, which starts a week from today, is that what we're going to be covering in that class is lots more about theme and through threads, more on this idea. The class is called How to Create a Structural Dream for Your Memoir. And so part of the structural dream in this memoir is the tightly woven themes and the narrative arc. And so we'll get into that specifically. We're going to be talking about place, which I think is hugely important for how to paint a picture that enchants your reader. And if you're writing about a particular part of the country or world, that's very powerful. A whole class on character and characterization, which is quite merited, I have to say. I mean, I just felt like I scratched the surface tonight. He has so many different things that he does to bring his characters alive. And then finally, narration, again, what Linda Joy was teaching, and lots of you have questions, and we can get into those as well. But, the narration and how to use the guiding narrator and the reflective narrator and how to seamlessly weave from one to the other and to feel like you have equal access to both of them when you're in your scenes. So that's what we'll be covering in that final class. So please take a look, and we're going to move into Q&A, but we would love for you guys to join us this spring. Take both classes if you want to, and this discount of saving the $50 is going to end the day after, end of the day on Wednesday, which is tomorrow. So you can sign up for these spring intensives, $99 for Tender Bar. I think it's $129 for the structure class, but we are quite excited about the structure class as well, in which we'll be covering all the different kinds of structures that exist and giving you guys a sense of, okay, like what is the right entry point for your own structure? How do you want to handle that?
Yeah, and we find that people, one of the reasons we were excited about teaching how structure works in Tender Bar and also this structure class is that so many of the students that we work with and teach struggle so much with structure. It's the first question pretty much everybody asks. And at NAMW, National Association of Memoir Writers, we have discussions every month. And structure are at least half of the questions that I get on some of those discussions. So we're really looking forward to laying all this out for all of you.
Perfect. Okay, so a question from Kimberly, and I'm just going to leave this slide up rather than the Q&A slide in case some of you guys want to go and check out, the different offerings and what we have going on. But the question is, can you be both a guiding narrator and a reflective narrator, or is the goal to be one or the other?
You end up being both. What we're trying to do is define what they do, the function. We're sort of pulling it apart and saying, okay, here this is happening and here this is happening. There are places where perhaps you guided the reader and then you're reflecting. I mean, they may be happening, in the same scene, but it helps to notice, am I moving through people through time right now, or am I pausing for my thoughts? Or maybe you're moving them through time and then you pause and then you reflect on something that happened or an association that you have, even a flashback. We didn't even get into all that, but we will in the other classes, that, how to work with time, how narration guides people through time and their reflection.
Yeah, and that is going to be a real focus of that final class 4, when we get into the narration, like how are you both? When is he guiding? When is he reflecting? And I just think J.R. Moehringer is like perhaps one of the most skilled memoirists I've ever seen on that particular point. Just how he moves so seamlessly with the narration. So he's kind of like showing you and taking you places, and then he stops, and that reflection that he brings in, this thing that we're always hounding on in our longer classes about what sense do you make of it? Why does this matter? That's the job of the reflective narrator, to come in and say, this is why this matters. This is why this is pertinent. It's that reflective voice, and it's quite powerful. So I definitely want to encourage you guys to delve deeper into that. Marian asks, when performing reflective narration, is it best to do throughout the memoir or have it in the last chapter?
Oh, yeah. Well, we want to know, we readers want to know what you're thinking and feeling from the first chapter on. So it is woven into a scene. And it's one example that we'll teach, but just briefly, something happens, something significant happens, either an exchange with another character or something like that. And then, okay, so what did you think of that? How did that feel to you? What sense do you make of it? That comes right after that dialogue exchange often. And so the reflection keeps the intimacy. And you'll see if you're reading Tender Bar how from the very first 2 paragraphs, you're right next to his heart. You're right there with him and what he's thinking and feeling all the way through.
So true. Yeah, and Patricia says, I love the idea of things and places as characters. Um, and I gave an example of the bicentennial couch, of course, but the places, and we'll get into this more, but he gives a lot of characterization to Arizona, a lot of characterization to Manhasset. That's why I think that it merits a whole class, is because those two places, as those of you who have been to each of them know, are very, very different. And the people are very different, and the weather is very different, and how people speak is very different. And he captures the people and the essence of all of that. And so I always think that memoir that does a really good job lodging the reader in place is one of my favorite things, because part of why I like to read memoirs is to go on a journey. And it's not just travel memoir. I'm not talking about reading because I want to have an armchair travel. It's because I want to really experience a place that someone knows intimately. So we'll talk more about how he does that, but it's quite powerful.
And we go to Yale too. You know, if you've never been to Yale, I'm like, I felt, that's what Yale is like. He's very thorough, you know.
Yeah, and he can get to Manhasset from Yale quite quickly to get to the bar and have a drink. So Yvette asks, is dialogue required for memoir, or is it sufficient to have vivid language and imagery to draw the reader in?
Well, don't you think, Brooke, the styles of books are very different, but if it's all narrated, A, it's a long haul to read all that, and B, dialogue is really about characterization. And I know that we know that a lot of memoirists get all tangled up about dialogue because they're like, well, it happened a long time ago and I'm making things up and so on. But there is a skill as a memoirist to creating authentic dialogue, and we'll, be teaching that. We do teach that. It's part of characterization. So if everything is narrated, it is not as vivid usually. I don't know how you write, so maybe you can do it, but we recommend that you have.
I think it's required. I mean, I really do, because I just think that without it, I mean, Linda Joy makes a good point about the slog, but it's how people talk, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the dialogue in this book is incredible. These guys and how they speak, and you want to be able to see that. And so it's about showing. When you talk about showing versus telling, there's a lot that is involved in that is not to do with dialogue, but dialogue is an automatic way to show, and it also gives you an opportunity to give people's mannerisms and how they walk around and the things they do with their hands, and so all of that, is super important to the story, actually. Okay, a question from Heidi. How does the author proceed to build these into the story, all the points you spoke of? Are they pre-planned or do they emerge in the stage of writing with the flow? That's a great question, Heidi. I mean, I think in that is the skill. One of the reasons that we teach these classes, and the long class in particular, is the craft. There is a lot of craft involved in learning how to write memoir, and it's not, this is what people start to write memoir, in my opinion, a lot of times, they start journaling, right? They're like, I'm kind of unpacking my life. I'm trying to understand and process and make sense of my experience. And journaling is basically telling. There's no two ways about it. It's like, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And then crafting a story, you need to learn the craft that is technically fiction. A lot of it is fiction, but also, and I just mean the craft, in terms of like the elements that you learn in fiction, and you use them to tell your true story. And then memoir has its very unique elements to it that are not accessible to fiction writers. And so it's just a learning, and you practice and you take classes, so you're doing the right thing for sure. It takes a long time.
Yeah, it's a journey for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so lots of questions. Trish says, will you be addressing theme, character, narration, et cetera, in the structure class? So if you guys go online, you can see what we're addressing in each of the classes, and I, obviously encourage you to do that. The structure class starts in April. And we have, we're going to do like an overview of structures. We're going to talk about the traditional story arc. And then we're also going to talk about tools that support structure, like these craft elements and how to integrate them into structure. I'll say this about structure, which is I've been coaching writers for a long time. I've been working with writers for 20 years and memoirists for about 12. And when people come to me because they are in crisis, it is because their structure is either a mess or non-existent, and they have written themselves into either a structureless environment or they're so wrapped around an axle around like, well, what should it be? And I don't get it. And I'm not sure where to enter in. And I don't know the arc of my story. And so having a firm foundation for structure is like having a safety net for yourself. It's like you're a bit of a trapeze artist when you're a memoirist, and it's like, well, get that net underneath you. You need it. And that's the structure, is like just knowing that you're held in an environment. And so I actually think it's one of the most important things that memoirists need, but oftentimes you don't know that you need it until you are stuck. So
yeah.
It's hugely, hugely helpful.
That is usually the mess that people get tangled up in, and really I've been there too. Oh boy, I wrote myself into a corner. Now how do I get out? And so there's ways to learn to think about your structure and how to, wrestle with it and the questions to ask. And we get into all of that.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so we don't have enough time to answer all these questions, and they're such good questions. So if you didn't get your question answered, please email it to me, and I will answer it so that you get your, the answer. But Kim has a great one to end with, which is, I hear that I should cut every word that isn't absolutely necessary, which might be a little extreme. But the point is, how do you balance that with exquisite detail? How do you know which word, which detail is important or even critical?
Revision. I mean, that's a late stage question. And I think by the time you've been working with your themes and your scenes and all these other craft issues, you can tell. I mean, you and your editor can really focus in on what is absolutely painting a picture, creating a feeling, creating movement, offering resolution. The words are connected with all of the, you might say, structural, writerly elements that are coming together, the arc of it, have the through threads. And so in late stage editing, that gets solved. But in the meantime, the more you develop these sub layers of craft, the many layers of them, the easier it is to see that, I think. What would you say, Brooke?
Yeah, and discernment. I mean, and it comes with time. It's why people become better, more skilled writers the more they do it. It's a fiction that you're divinely inspired. I mean, some people might be. Supposedly, Jack Kerouac was, a few people in history, but it's that practice and being like, yes, this is good. Yes, this brings me alive. I feel excited when I'm reading it. And if it feels flat to you, you come back and you keep working on it. And yes, editors are your friends. Barbara actually has a question about whether the classes include feedback, and I want to address it because these short classes don't, because they're just 4-week kind of intensives. But in the long class, we do offer extensive feedback, and you're doing a lot of writing, and you're getting a lot of one-on-one comments from us as your mentors. And so if you're really craving that kind of feedback from someone who is going to tell you, like, look, you're doing too much telling. That's one of the main things I see, too much telling, or the writing is not enough in scene, or, I rarely am telling people, oh, you're doing too much exquisite detail. I honestly, don't I've ever said that. Mostly I'm saying, bring this story alive, bring me in. And so if you want to have that kind of feedback, I encourage you to check out the 6-month class. And yes, I mean, for those of you, people are always asking about the recording. We record everything always, and if you sign up for our classes, you get the recordings, and they last forever, and you can turn back to them and the slides. You know, we're very generous with the information, and we want you guys to take a lot out of these classes and really begin to implement them into your work. And so yes to all the material, you know, that comes with it. And the mastering structure class will come with some handouts, but not feedback, because that gets kind of big, and we reserve it for the 6-month class. So
Yes.
all right.
Great.
We're on the hour, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a real honor to just have all of you attend and take your time out tonight and be with us and be excited about Memoir. Be in touch if you have any questions for us whatsoever. I hope some of you will join us for the spring classes.
Yes, love to see you all join us, and thank you so much for being with us today. It was great to hear your questions, and let us know if you have any more questions about the class.
Yeah. All right. Good night, Linda Joy. Thank you.
Goodbye. Good night. Thank you all. Bye-bye.